The compass was busted, totally whacked out like someone had messed with the magnetic poles themselves. Jake Morrison squinted at the spinning needle, then up at the twisted tree-line that shouldn't exist anywhere near the Arizona desert. "Y'all seeing this, or did I finally lose it?" he called out to his crew, his Tennessee drawl cutting through the thick, weird silence that had settled over everything like a wet blanket. His hiking boots crunched on soil that was too dark, too rich for this part of the state. Behind him, his three companions had stopped dead in their tracks, staring at what lay beyond the scraggly pines that had appeared out of nowhere about 2 miles back. Madison Torres, the group's navigator and Jake's ex-girlfriend from college, had her phone out, frantically swiping at a screen that showed nothing but static. "GPS is fried, Jake. Like, completely toast. We shouldn't even be here according to every map I've got downloaded." Her voice had that edge to it, the one she got when things weren't adding up and she didn't like it one bit. Trevor Banks, built like a linebacker and twice as stubborn, pushed past them both, his tactical backpack bouncing against his shoulders. "Man, forget the tech. Look at that." He pointed straight ahead, and that's when they all saw it properly for the first time. Rising out of the impossible forest was a city, gray and sprawling, its buildings a weird mix of old-timey architecture and something else, something that looked almost organic, like the structures had grown instead of being built. Smoke or maybe mist curled up from what might have been chimneys or vents, and the whole place had this greenish tint to it, like looking at something through a dirty aquarium. The fourth member of their group, Rachel Kim, a geology grad student who joined them for what was supposed to be a simple survey expedition, had gone pale. "That's not on any geological survey. That's not on any survey, period. Cities don't just appear, guys. They don't just pop up in the middle of documented terrain." Her hands were shaking as she pulled out her own equipment, a fancy ground-penetrating radar setup that probably cost more than Jake's truck. They'd been out here for 3 days, documenting unusual seismic readings that Rachel's professor had flagged. Small stuff, barely worth noticing except for how regular the patterns were, like a heartbeat coming from deep underground. The university had funded a small expedition, nothing major, just enough to get a handful of students and one guide, that being Jake, out into the desert to poke around. Should have been simple. Should have been boring, even. Instead, they'd watched their surroundings slowly transform over the past 6 hours of hiking, the desert giving way to scrubland, then to this forest that had no business existing, and now to a whole damn city that looked like it had been copy-pasted from some fever dream. "We should head back," Madison said, but her voice didn't carry much conviction. They all knew the truth without saying it out loud, they had no idea which direction back even was anymore. The sun was in the wrong position, too low and too red for noon, which is what their watches all claimed it was. Trevor, being Trevor, was already moving forward. "Nah, we came out here to investigate weird stuff, and this is officially the weirdest stuff I've ever seen. I'm not tucking tail before we at least check it out." He had his camera out, one of those expensive jobs that adventure vloggers used, already recording as he narrated in his announcer voice. "Day 3 of the survey expedition, and we've stumbled onto what appears to be an uncharted settlement of significant size. Architecture suggests early 20th century, but with unusual modifications." Jake swore under his breath and jogged to catch up, because somebody had to keep the big idiot from walking into something dangerous. Madison and Rachel exchanged a look, then followed, because the alternative was standing alone in creepy woods that shouldn't exist while the sun did impossible things in the sky. The forest thinned out as they approached, giving way to what might have once been farmland, though nothing was growing in the fields now except some kind of gray-green moss that seemed to pulse slightly, like it was breathing. The city walls, and they were definitely walls, rose up about 20 feet, made of stone blocks that had been fit together so precisely you couldn't slide a knife blade between them. Thing was, some of the blocks had windows. Not carved into them, but part of them, like someone had built the wall out of salvaged buildings, crushing them down and reforming them into a barrier. "That's messed up," Trevor muttered, his camera focused on a section where you could still see part of a wooden door frame embedded in the stone, weathered and gray but recognizable. That's some serious horror movie vibes right there. They found the gate easily enough, a massive thing made of iron or maybe steel, green with age and standing open like a mouth. No guards, no people, no sounds except for a low humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Jake pulled out his hunting knife, not that it would do much good against whatever could build a place like this, but it made him feel slightly better. Stay close, stay alert, and if I say run, you run. Got it? He looked at each of them until they nodded, even Trevor, who'd finally stopped filming and had his own knife out. They passed through the gate, and the temperature dropped a good 15 degrees, just like that, like they'd walked through an invisible curtain of cold air. Their breath misted out in front of them, which was wild considering it had been pushing 90 degrees in the desert. The city inside was worse than the outside suggested. The streets were cobblestone, worn smooth by God knows how many feet, and they wound between buildings that leaned toward each other like they were sharing secrets. Most of the structures were 3 or 4 stories tall, with windows that were too narrow and doors that were too wide, and all of it was built from that same gray stone, sometimes mixed with dark wood that looked petrified. Street lamps lined the roads, old gas lamp style, but they were glowing with that same greenish light, and there was no flame visible inside them, just a steady luminescence that made everything look sickly and strange. Signs hung from some of the buildings, written in English but in such an old-fashioned script that it was hard to read. Jake made out apothecary on one, boarding house on another, and what might have been town hall on a larger building at what looked like the center of the city. "Where is everybody?" Rachel whispered, and that was the question, wasn't it? A city this size should have people, should have noise, should have life. Instead, it was silent except for that humming and the sound of their own footsteps echoing off the stone. Madison had her phone out again, trying to get any kind of signal, trying to document what they were seeing. This is insane. This is absolutely insane. We need to contact someone, we need to report this. But there was no signal, no connection to the outside world, assuming the outside world was even still where they'd left it. Jake was starting to seriously doubt that last part. They'd made it maybe 3 blocks into the city when they saw the first figure. It was standing in an alleyway between 2 buildings, just standing there, motionless. Human-shaped, definitely, but something was off about the proportions, the way it held itself. Too stiff, too still, like a mannequin or a statue. Trevor raised his camera, then lowered it again. "Hey," he called out. "Hey, we're lost, can you help us?" The figure didn't respond, didn't even twitch. Jake felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "Trevor, don't," but Trevor was already walking toward the alley, because of course he was. The figure moved when Trevor got within about 10 feet of it, and it moved wrong. Not smooth like a person walking, but jerky, like a puppet with half its strings cut. It turned toward Trevor, and they all saw its face, or what should have been its face. The features were there, eyes and nose and mouth, but they were all slightly off, positioned just a little wrong, like someone had described a human face but never actually seen one. Its skin was gray, the same color as the stone buildings, and its eyes were cloudy white, no iris, no pupil, just blank white that somehow still conveyed the sense of looking, of seeing. Its mouth opened, way wider than any mouth should, and it made a sound, a wet rattling noise that might have been trying to be words but wasn't even close. Trevor scrambled backward so fast he nearly fell on his ass, and Jake grabbed him by the collar and hauled him back toward the group. The figure lurched forward, taking 1 step, then another, its movements getting smoother, like it was remembering how to walk. Then there were more of them, stepping out of doorways and from around corners, all with that same gray skin, those same wrong faces, those same cloudy eyes. They moved silent except for that rattling sound they made, and there were dozens of them, maybe more, filling the street ahead and behind. "Oh hell no," Madison breathed, and they ran. Jake took the lead because he was the fastest and he knew how to navigate, even in unfamiliar territory. They bolted down a side street, the things behind them moving faster now, their footsteps slapping against the cobblestones in an uneven rhythm. Rachel was gasping already, her academic lifestyle not lending itself to cardio, and Trevor had to practically drag her along. They turned a corner and found more of the creatures, shambling toward them from the opposite direction. "Left!" Jake shouted, and they veered into what looked like it might have been a marketplace once, stalls and carts lining an open square, all of it covered in that gray-green moss. The creatures didn't run, not exactly, but they were fast in their weird way, cutting off angles, herding the group deeper into the city. Madison grabbed Jake's arm and pointed to a building with its door hanging open, a church maybe, with a tall steeple and stained glass windows that glowed with interior light. They didn't have a lot of options, so Jake made the call and they bolted for it, piling through the door and slamming it shut behind them. There was a heavy wooden bar, and Trevor dropped it into place just as the first of the creatures hit the door from outside, that rattling sound turning into something almost like a moan, hungry and desperate. Inside, the church or whatever it was wasn't quite right either. The pews were there, rows of them facing an altar, but the religious symbols were all wrong, twisted versions of crosses and other shapes that hurt to look at too long, like they were designed to invoke something other than comfort. The greenish light came from candles that burned without melting, hundreds of them, covering every surface. And standing at the altar, his back to them, was a man, or at least something that looked more like a man than the creatures outside did. He was tall, wearing what might have been a priest's robes once, black fabric that seemed to absorb the light around it. When he turned, his face was human, sharp features and dark eyes that were clear and aware, not clouded like the others. He smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, with an accent that Jake couldn't quite place, something old-fashioned and formal. "It's been quite some time since we've had visitors from the world above. Please, don't be alarmed by my congregation outside. They're simply eager to meet you. They get so few opportunities for social interaction these days." He moved down from the altar with smooth, gliding steps, his hands clasped in front of him. "My name is Reverend Thomas Blackwood, and this is the city of Ashford, or what remains of it. You've stumbled into a place that was meant to stay hidden, I'm afraid." Jake kept his knife out, positioning himself between Blackwood and the others. "What are those things? What is this place?" The pounding on the door continued, steady and relentless, and he could hear wood starting to splinter. Blackwood glanced at the door, unconcerned. "Those things as you call them were people once, citizens of Ashford, believers in a great work that would free humanity from the tyranny of death itself. We succeeded, in a fashion, though perhaps not in the way we intended. The year was 1923 when we performed the grand ritual, when we opened the door to what lies beneath the world and invited it in. We became immortal, in our way. Eternal. But eternity has a price, and the price was our humanity, our vitality, our connection to the world of the living." Rachel had found her voice again, shaky but functional. "You're telling us this city has been here since 1923? That's over 100 years. That's impossible. Someone would have found it, satellites would have spotted it." Blackwood's smile widened. "This city exists in the spaces between, young lady. We folded ourselves out of the world, created a pocket of existence separate from the normal flow of time and space. This is both nowhere and everywhere, hidden in plain sight. The only reason you found us is because we've been weakening. The ritual that sustains us is failing, and as it fails, we bleed back into reality. Those seismic readings you were investigating? Those were us, knocking on the walls of our prison, hoping someone would hear." Madison had been inching toward a side door, but Blackwood's eyes snapped to her and she froze. "I wouldn't advise attempting to flee, my dear. The citizens outside are quite insistent, and while I can control them to some degree, their hunger is strong. They remember what it was to be alive, you see, and your presence here, your warmth, your vitality, it drives them to distraction. They want what you have. They want to take it, to consume it, to remember for just a moment what it felt like to draw breath and feel a heartbeat. His expression shifted, becoming almost sad. I don't blame them. I remember too, though I've retained more of myself than most. The ritual required a sacrifice, you see, a willing vessel to channel the energies. I was that vessel, the blessed conduit. It preserved me better than the others, but it also bound me here, unable to leave, unable to die, unable to do anything but watch as my flock slowly degraded into the shambling shadows you see now. Trevor had his camera out again, because apparently even mortal terror couldn't stop him from documenting things. So what do you want with us? Why tell us all this? Blackwood turned his attention to Trevor, and there was something calculating in his gaze. Because you, dear boy, are the first fresh souls to enter Ashford in over 90 years. Because the ritual is failing, but it could be renewed, reinforced, if we had the right components. Because I am so very, very tired of this existence, and you represent a chance, however slim, for either salvation or damnation, and at this point I'm not particular about which. The door behind them finally gave way with a crash that echoed through the church, and the creatures poured in, a dozen of them, their cloudy eyes fixed on the group, their mouths opening and closing with that terrible rattling sound. But Blackwood raised a hand, and they stopped, freezing in place like puppets with their strings pulled taut. Not yet, my children. Not yet. These guests and I have much to discuss, and I would prefer to do so civilly. He gestured toward a door behind the altar. Come, let us retire to more comfortable surroundings, and I will explain exactly what needs to happen next. You have a choice to make, all of you, a choice that will determine not only your fate but the fate of everyone who was foolish enough to seek immortality in the arms of the dark. Jake looked at his crew, saw the fear in their eyes but also the determination. They were trapped, well and truly, in a city that shouldn't exist, surrounded by things that used to be people, with a crazy immortal priest calling the shots. But they were alive, and where there was life, there was a chance. We're listening, Jake said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline screaming through his veins. But if you or your congregation try anything, we're gonna fight, and we're gonna make it hurt. Blackwood laughed, a genuine sound that held both amusement and approval. Excellent. Spirit. I'd hoped you'd have spirit. The ritual requires will, you see, not just flesh. Come, come. He turned and glided toward the back door, and after a moment's hesitation, they followed, because staying with the frozen creatures seemed like an even worse option. The door led to a staircase that spiraled down, lit by more of those impossible candles, their green flames casting dancing shadows on walls that were carved with intricate symbols and diagrams. They descended for what felt like way too long, going down deeper than any church basement should go, until Jake's ears popped from the pressure change. The stairs finally opened into a chamber that was part library, part laboratory, and part something else entirely. Books lined the walls, thousands of them, bound in leather and cloth and materials Jake didn't want to think too hard about. Tables held equipment, some of it recognizable as scientific instruments from the early 20th century, others looking like they'd been designed by someone with only a passing familiarity with Euclidean geometry. And in the center of it all was a circle carved into the stone floor, filled with more of those twisted symbols, with channels cut into the rock that were stained dark with substances that definitely weren't oil. Rachel couldn't help herself, drawn to the books and equipment like a moth to flame, her academic curiosity overriding her fear. She pulled out one of the books, carefully, and flipped through pages filled with dense text and detailed illustrations. This is talking about layered realities, about using harmonic resonance to create sustainable pocket dimensions. This is theoretical physics mixed with occultism? She looked up at Blackwood, her expression confused and fascinated in equal measure. How did you even conceive of this in 1923? We barely understood quantum mechanics. Blackwood moved to stand beside the circle, running his fingers along the carved symbols with something like affection. We had help, dear girl. The knowledge came from below, from the spaces between the stars and beneath the earth, from entities that exist outside the normal constraints of reality. They whispered their secrets to those willing to listen, and we, the founders of Ashford, we listened very carefully indeed. We thought we could use their knowledge without paying their price. We were wrong. He looked up at them, and for the first time, they could see the age in his eyes, the weight of a century of cursed existence. The ritual created a prison as much as a sanctuary. We cannot die, but we cannot truly live. We're suspended, degrading slowly, becoming less than human with each passing year. The original plan was to create a utopia, a place where death held no sway, where we could pursue knowledge and enlightenment without the constraints of mortal time. Instead, we created hell. Madison had been quietly exploring the edges of the chamber, and she found something that made her suck in a sharp breath. "Jake, you need to see this." She was standing in front of a wall covered in photographs, old ones, sepia-toned and fading, showing the citizens of Ashford as they'd been before the ritual. Families, couples, children, all dressed in 1920s fashion, all smiling at the camera with hope and excitement in their eyes. And beneath each photo was another one, more recent, showing what those people had become, the gray-skinned, dead-eyed creatures that had chased them through the streets. The degradation was obvious, a slow slide from human to something else, something less. "They trusted me," Blackwood said softly, and there was genuine pain in his voice. "They believed in the dream I sold them, the promise of eternal life and endless possibility. 643 people followed me into damnation, including 28 children. The children." He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were wet with tears that didn't fall. The children degraded fastest. Their minds couldn't handle the strain of immortality, couldn't process the wrongness of existence outside normal space and time. They became feral within the first decade, lost to hunger and confusion. We had to contain them. Separate them from the others. They're in the deep places now, in the tunnels beneath the city, and they've become something far worse than what you encountered above. Trevor had stopped filming, his face pale. "Man, this is seriously messed up. You're telling us you've got zombie kids running around in tunnels somewhere?" Blackwood's expression hardened. "They are not zombies, young man. They are my responsibility, my burden, my eternal shame. And they are the reason you are here, whether you know it or not. The ritual is failing because they are feeding on it, draining the energy that sustains the pocket dimension, trying to claw their way back to the world of the living through sheer instinct and hunger. When the ritual collapses completely, and it will within the next few days, Ashford will snap back into normal reality, and everything in it will be unleashed on an unsuspecting world. 643 immortal, degraded husks with an insatiable hunger for life force, plus 38 children who have become predators of a type the modern world has never seen." Jake felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "You're saying if we don't do something, all those things are gonna pop into existence somewhere in Arizona and start attacking people?" Blackwood nodded slowly. "Not just attacking. Consuming. They feed on vitality, on life essence. One of my citizens could drain a human being in minutes, leaving nothing but a withered husk. And they would multiply, because their hunger is contagious. Those they feed upon don't die, not truly. They rise again as something similar, driven by the same need. Within weeks, your modern world would fall to a plague of the undead unlike anything in your horror stories." The chamber fell silent except for the faint humming that permeated everything, and Jake could feel the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. "Okay, so what's the play? You said we had a choice. What are our options?" Blackwood gestured to the circle on the floor. "Option 1. You help me perform a reversal ritual. It requires fresh blood, freely given, and a willingness to channel energies that will likely kill whoever serves as the conduit. If it works, it will undo the original ritual, collapse the pocket dimension in a controlled manner, and allow all of us, myself included, to finally die. Ashford will be erased from existence, and the world will be safe." Madison crossed her arms. "And option 2? Blackwood's smile was grim. "Option 2, you attempt to escape, either successfully fleeing back to your world and leaving us to inevitably collapse into it, or failing in being consumed by my congregation, who are currently being held back only by my will, which weakens by the hour. There is no option 3. There is no rescue coming. You walked into a place outside of normal causality, and the only ways out are through sacrifice or death. Rachel was still looking at the books, her mind clearly racing. What about reinforcing the ritual? You said it could be renewed. Couldn't we just patch it, keep this place stable? Blackwood shook his head. The cost would be your lives, your essences, woven into the fabric of the pocket dimension to sustain it for perhaps another century. You would become like me, aware but trapped, watching yourselves slowly degrade into what the others have become. I would not wish this existence on anyone, which is why I'm offering you the chance to end it instead. Trevor spoke up, his voice uncharacteristically serious. How do we know you're telling the truth? How do we know this reversal ritual isn't just another trap? It was a fair question, and Blackwood seemed to respect it. He moved to one of the tables and picked up a leather journal, old and worn. This is my personal diary, kept since the day we performed the grand ritual. Every page documents the slow horror of what we became, the mistakes we made, the prices we paid. Read it if you wish. See the truth of Ashford with your own eyes. I have no reason to lie to you. If I wanted you dead or consumed, I would simply release my hold on the congregation and let nature take its course. Jake took the journal, flipping through pages filled with neat, precise handwriting that gradually became more erratic and desperate as the years progressed. He saw dates, 1924, 1935, 1950, 1978, 2001, all the way up to entries from just weeks ago. The words painted a picture of slow madness, of watching loved ones degrade, of endless guilt and the crushing weight of responsibility for a mistake that couldn't be undone. He handed the journal to the others, letting them read while he studied Blackwood. The man, if he could still be called that, stood quietly, not pressing them, just waiting with the patience of someone who had literally all the time in the world. Madison finished reading and looked up, her eyes hard. If we do this ritual, if we help you end this, what exactly happens to us? You said it would likely kill the conduit. What about the rest? Blackwood moved to the circle, kneeling beside it and tracing the symbols with one finger. The reversal requires a sacrifice, someone to channel the energies in reverse, to pull the threads of the ritual back and unravel them. That person will almost certainly die, their life force consumed in the process. The others would need to provide blood to complete the circuit, to anchor the reversal in the physical world. They would survive, though weakened. Once the ritual completes, the pocket dimension will collapse over the course of approximately 1 hour, giving the survivors time to reach the boundaries and step back into normal reality. Everything else, the city, the citizens, myself included, will simply cease to exist. Rachel had tears running down her face, but her voice was steady. How do we know it will work? What if we do this and it just makes things worse? Blackwood stood, his expression solemn. You don't know. You can't know. Magic, true magic of the type we practiced, is never certain. The original ritual was supposed to grant eternal youth and vitality, and instead it gave us this cursed half-life. The reversal could fail, could backfire, could do any number of unexpected things. But the alternative is guaranteed catastrophe. In 3 days, maybe 4, the pocket dimension will collapse on its own, chaotically, and Ashford will be dumped back into reality. And then your world will learn what true horror is. The group huddled together, speaking in low voices, while Blackwood gave them space. Jake looked at each of his friends, seeing the fear and confusion and anger in their faces. This is insane, he said quietly. All of this is completely insane. But if he's telling the truth, and I think he is, we don't have a lot of choice. Trevor shook his head violently. There's always a choice, man. We could try to fight our way out, make a run for it. Madison put a hand on his arm. And if we make it? If we get back to the real world? What then? Do we tell people? Do we warn them? Who would even believe us? And then in a few days, all those things appear out of nowhere and start killing people, and it's on us for not stopping it when we had the chance. Rachel wiped her eyes, pulling herself together with visible effort. If we're really doing this, then we need to understand the ritual completely. We need to know exactly what we're getting into. She turned to Blackwood. Show us everything. Explain the process, the requirements, the risks. All of it. Blackwood nodded, a glimmer of respect in his ancient eyes. Very well. Come, gather around the circle, and I will teach you how to undo a century of mistakes. The next several hours were a crash course in occult theory and practice that would have given any university professor a heart attack. Blackwood explained the symbols, the energy flows, the precise way blood needed to be offered and words needed to be spoken. The ritual wasn't just magic, it was a kind of physics, manipulating the fundamental forces that held the pocket dimension together and unwinding them like pulling a thread from a sweater. The conduit, whoever volunteered for that role, would need to stand at the center of the circle and essentially become a lightning rod for energies that existed outside normal space-time. It would be agonizing, Blackwood warned them, and the chances of survival were minimal at best. I'll do it, Jake said, before he could talk himself out of it. The others immediately protested, but he cut them off. No, listen. You three are students, you've got your whole lives ahead of you. I'm just a guide, a guy who knows how to read a map and avoid rattlesnakes. If someone's gotta take the fall here, it should be me. Trevor grabbed him by the shoulders. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, and I once watched a guy try to fight a cactus. You're not sacrificing yourself just because you think you're less important. Blackwood interrupted gently. While the sentiment is noble, the choice of conduit isn't entirely up to personal preference. The ritual requires someone with a strong will and a clear sense of purpose. The energies involved will try to overwhelm the conduit's consciousness, to scatter it across the dimensions. Only someone with absolute determination can hold themselves together long enough for the reversal to complete. He looked at each of them in turn. I cannot tell you who among you is best suited. That's something you must determine yourselves. They argued about it, voices rising and falling in the underground chamber while Blackwood prepared the other components of the ritual, grinding herbs that shouldn't exist and mixing liquids that glowed with their own internal light. Eventually, exhausted and stressed beyond measure, they fell into silence. It was Rachel who spoke first, her voice quiet but firm. It should be me. They all turned to look at her, and she straightened her shoulders. I'm the scientist. I'm the one who understands what's happening here, at least as much as anyone can. And I'm the one who got us into this, who convinced the university to fund the expedition, who wanted to investigate the seismic readings. This is my responsibility. Madison started to argue, but Rachel shook her head. No, I've made up my mind. If this works, you three need to get back and tell people what happened here. Tell my story. Make sure everyone knows that Ashford existed, that these people were real, and that they deserved better than what they got. She looked at Blackwood. They did deserve better, didn't they? They weren't evil people, just desperate ones who made a terrible mistake. Blackwood's expression softened. They were dreamers, every one of them. They wanted to build something beautiful and eternal. Their only crime was trusting me, and my only crime was arrogance, the belief that I could control forces I barely understood. Yes, they deserved better. We all did. Jake wanted to protest, wanted to pull rank as the expedition leader and demand that he be the one to take the risk, but looking at Rachel's face, he could see the determination there, the acceptance. She'd made her choice, and respecting that choice, honoring her agency in this impossible situation, was maybe the only thing he could do for her. Okay, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Okay, but we're gonna fight like hell to make sure you survive this, you hear me? We're not giving up on you. Rachel smiled, small and sad. I appreciate that. But let's be realistic about the odds. Blackwood gathered them around the circle as the time approached. He'd explained that the ritual needed to be performed at what he called a threshold moment, when the boundary between the pocket dimension and normal reality was thinnest. According to his calculations, that would occur in approximately 1 hour. They spent that time preparing, with Blackwood walking them through every step multiple times until they could recite the process in their sleep. Madison, Trevor, and Jake would stand at 3 points around the circle, each cutting their palm and letting blood drip onto specific symbols while reciting phrases in a language that hurt to speak, words that seemed to twist reality around them just by being vocalized. Rachel would stand at the center, her feet on a symbol that looked like a spiral falling into itself, and she would open herself to the energies of the ritual, becoming the pathway through which the reversal would flow. Blackwood would guide the process, using his connection to the original ritual to help Rachel control the flow, but he'd been clear that his power was limited. "I can show you the way," he'd said, "but I cannot walk it for you. The reversal requires someone from outside the pocket dimension, someone with a connection to normal reality. I am too deeply woven into this place. I cannot be the conduit for its destruction." The hour passed too quickly and too slowly at once, measured by the pounding of their hearts and the weight of what they were about to attempt. When Blackwood finally declared that the threshold moment had arrived, Jake could feel it, a sort of electricity in the air, a sense that the walls between worlds were growing thin. Rachel took her position in the center of the circle, and despite her fear, her hands were steady. Madison, Trevor, and Jake moved to their assigned positions, each holding a knife that Blackwood had provided, ancient blades with handles wrapped in leather that had gone dark with age. "Remember," Blackwood said, his voice taking on a formal, ritual tone, "once we begin, we cannot stop. To halt the ritual midway would be to invite catastrophic collapse. No matter what happens, no matter what you see or hear, you must complete your parts. Rachel, you will experience things that no human mind is meant to process. You must hold on to who you are, to your sense of self. If you lose yourself in the flow, the ritual will fail and the backlash will likely kill all of us. Do you understand?" Rachel nodded, swallowing hard. "I understand. I'm ready." Blackwood began to chant, words that seemed to come from deep within the earth, resonating with harmonics that made the symbols on the floor glow with that sickly green light. Jake cut his palm, wincing at the sharp pain, and let blood drip onto the symbol at his feet. Madison and Trevor did the same, their blood hitting the stone and immediately beginning to flow along the carved channels, moving with a life of its own, running toward the center where Rachel stood. The three of them began to recite the phrases Blackwood had taught them, stumbling over the pronunciation at first but finding their rhythm as the ritual took hold. Rachel gasped as the blood reached her, the channels at her feet filling and beginning to glow. Her eyes went wide, then wider, her pupils dilating until her eyes were almost entirely black. Energy started to swirl around her, visible as distortions in the air, like heat shimmer but moving in patterns that followed the symbols on the floor. Blackwood's chanting grew louder, more insistent, and the chamber began to shake, dust and small stones falling from the ceiling. The candles flared brighter, their green flames reaching toward the ceiling, and Jake could hear sounds from above, the rattle and cries of the congregation as they felt the ritual beginning. Rachel's back arched, her mouth opening in a silent scream as energy poured into her, through her, using her as a conduit just as Blackwood had described. Jake wanted to run to her, to pull her out of the circle and stop this madness, but he forced himself to keep reciting the phrases, to keep his blood flowing onto the symbol. Madison was crying openly, tears streaming down her face as she watched her friend suffer, but her voice never wavered. Trevor's face was set in grim determination, his usual bravado stripped away to reveal the core of strength underneath. The shaking intensified, and cracks appeared in the walls of the chamber, spreading like spiderwebs. Through the cracks, Jake could see nothing, not darkness but an absence, a void where reality simply stopped. The pocket dimension was coming apart, the threads that held it together being pulled loose by the reversal. Blackwood's form began to flicker, becoming translucent, and he laughed, a sound of pure relief. "Yes. Yes, it's working. Hold steady, all of you. Just a little longer." Rachel finally found her voice, and she screamed, a sound of agony and effort that echoed through the chamber and beyond. The energy around her reached a crescendo, a vortex of power that lifted her off her feet, suspending her in the air as it poured through her in torrents. Her skin began to glow from within, veins standing out in stark relief, and Jake realized with horror that he could see through her, could see the outline of her skeleton as the energies threatened to burn her away entirely. "Rachel," he shouted, but his voice was lost in the roar of the ritual. Blackwood raised his arms, his body now almost completely transparent. The final phrase. "All together, now!" He began to speak words that seemed to unmake reality itself, and the others joined in, Jake and Madison and Trevor all shouting the syllables that Blackwood had drilled into them. Rachel, impossibly, joined in too, her voice a ragged whisper that somehow carried over all the other sounds. The symbols on the floor blazed with light so bright Jake had to squint, and there was a sound like the world's largest bell being struck, a deep resonant tone that he felt in his bones, in his soul. And then, silence. The energy vanished, cut off like someone had flipped a switch. Rachel dropped to the floor, smoke rising from her clothes and skin. Jake broke from his position and ran to her, gathering her in his arms. She was still breathing, barely, her pulse weak and thready. Her eyes opened, and they were her own again, brown and human and filled with pain. "Did it work?" she whispered. Jake looked around the chamber. The symbols on the floor were dark now, inert, and the cracks in the walls were spreading, reality pouring in through the gaps like water through a failing dam. Blackwood was barely visible now, a ghost of a ghost, but he was smiling. "It worked. The reversal is complete. The pocket dimension is collapsing in a controlled manner, unwinding itself thread by thread. You have perhaps 45 minutes to reach the boundary and step back into your world." His gaze fell on Rachel, and there was profound gratitude in his ancient eyes. "Thank you, child. Thank you for giving us the ending we should have had a century ago. Thank you for saving the world from our mistakes." Madison and Trevor were already moving, gathering up their gear with shaking hands. Jake lifted Rachel as carefully as he could, and she whimpered with pain but nodded for him to move. They ran for the stairs, taking them two at a time, bursting back into the church above. The building was empty, the congregation gone, and through the windows they could see the city outside beginning to fade, buildings becoming translucent, the streets turning to mist. The dead citizens of Ashford were scattered throughout the city, all of them lying still, finally at peace as their cursed existence came to an end. They ran through the streets, following the path they'd taken earlier in reverse, watching as Ashford dissolved around them like a dream upon waking. The buildings became shadows, then outlines, then nothing at all. The ground beneath their feet remained solid, but only just, and they could feel it starting to give way. The city walls appeared ahead, the gates still standing open, and beyond it the forest that shouldn't exist was already thinning, the trees fading back into the desert scrubland they'd originally been hiking through. Jake's lungs burned and his arms ached from carrying Rachel, but he didn't slow down, didn't stop until they'd passed through the gate and were 100 yards beyond it. Only then did he risk a look back. Ashford was gone, completely erased, nothing remaining but empty desert under a sun that was finally in the right position for afternoon. The only evidence that the city had ever existed was the four of them, bloodied and exhausted and traumatized, standing in the middle of nowhere Arizona with a story no one would ever believe. Rachel stirred in his arms, her eyes opening. "We made it." Jake nodded, setting her down carefully against a rock. "We made it. You did it, Rachel. You saved everyone." She smiled weakly. "Tell my professor I found the source of the seismic readings. Tell him they've stopped now." And then her eyes rolled back and she went limp, and Jake's heart nearly stopped until he found her pulse, still there, still fighting. Madison was already on her phone, which miraculously had a signal again, calling for emergency services and trying to explain their location. Trevor sat down hard, his camera in his hands, and let out a shaky laugh. Did that really just happen? Did we really just save the world from Zombie City? Jake looked at the spot where Ashford had been, where 643 people had spent a century in cursed half-life, paying for one moment of arrogant ambition. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Yeah, I think we did." He thought of Blackwood's final smile, the relief and gratitude there, and hoped that wherever the Reverend and his congregation had gone, they'd found the peace that had been denied to them for so long. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed across the desert maybe 20 minutes later, and Jake had never been so happy to see Park Service markings in his life. As paramedics rushed to check on Rachel, loading her onto a stretcher with efficient care, Jake caught Madison's eye. She looked as wrecked as he felt, but there was something else there too, a kind of quiet pride. They'd faced the impossible and survived. They'd made a choice that mattered, that saved lives, even if no one else would ever know or believe it. The official report would say they'd gotten lost, that Rachel had suffered from dehydration and heat exhaustion, that they'd hallucinated most of what they claimed to remember. The seismic readings had indeed stopped, which the university attributed to natural settling of underground formations. No one went looking for a lost city because the GPS logs from their phones showed they'd never deviated from known terrain. In the end, Ashford became a story they told each other late at night, a shared trauma and triumph that bonded them together for life. Rachel recovered, though she never quite regained the vitality she'd had before serving as the conduit. Madison and Trevor both switched their majors to folklore and mythology, driven by a need to understand what they'd experienced. And Jake kept guiding expeditions into remote places, always watching for signs of things that shouldn't be, always ready to face the impossible one more time if needed. Because they knew the truth, the world was stranger and more dangerous than most people could imagine, and sometimes it took ordinary folks willing to make extraordinary choices to keep the darkness at bay. Ashford was gone, but its lesson remained: some doors should never be opened, some knowledge comes at too high a price, and the only thing more dangerous than dying is living forever with your mistakes.